Individualism versus collectivism. What does individualism versus collectivism have to do with data science? Quite a lot when it actually comes to defining fairness in our decisions, and so our algorithms. Thank you for joining today and listening in on what is sure to be one of the more controversial topics. If you like what you hear, please subscribe so that you'll get notified on future content. One of the biggest topics our culture faces today in defining justice is individualism versus collectivism. The question is whether your identity is primarily as an individual or as part of a group. Individualism emphasizes the value and progress of the individual and individual rights, whereas collectivism emphasizes the progress of the rights of a group. There is much debate on the differences between each and the result that each has had on societies. However, something that complicates the discussion and has historically spelled trouble for well-functioning societies is what happens when you combine collectivism with division, so that group identity is most valued and exists among competing groups within the same society. Let's start with a case where this might matter in a hotly debated example from the news: facial recognition. This is an example of where your preference for individualism versus collectivism might actually influence the outcome that you determine to be most fair. Let me be clear, the example we'll use here will make some assumptions to make the point of where this topic comes into play, but the details of the dilemma are not necessarily true to the real-life situation. You've probably seen a news story about facial recognition by now, where the algorithms work better on majority faces than minority faces, such as in Apple's iPhone security. The specific problem in this case may be amplified by things like training data that is not very well representative of the actual population for the users that are going to use it. For any who are watching who do not know, training data is simply the data that algorithms use to learn from. But let's assume that's been addressed and the training data has a good representation of people across each of the groups. And it's the more fundamental issue where models will become more accurate for a majority group because there is more information to learn from and because there is greater penalty when getting it wrong with a larger population because more people or individuals are impacted. This is where your view on individualism versus collectivism comes into consideration. Are you more concerned about the error among individual records or individuals, or are you more concerned about it between different classes or groups? Imagine if the proposed solution was to balance groups, which just means to make an equal number of examples for any group of concern, such as race or gender. Note that even this poses some trade-offs because it is not possible to fully represent equal numbers from every possible ethnicity or group of physical attributes. For example, those who have rare disorders or even disfigurement will almost certainly experience tools that do not work well as it does for the rest of the population. Let's say for this example that 80% of the users in the population are white and 20% are black. And let's say that we balance these out so that each group represents 50% in the training data. And the resulting model has become 10% less accurate for the white faces and 10% more accurate for black faces. So that now whatever the accuracy was is equivalent. This is a solution that is often proposed in such cases beyond the obvious preferred solutions like adding more data or creating individualized models to improve accuracy for everyone. With individualism, it would be argued that because you've reduced 4 individuals' accuracy by 10% each, in order to gain 10% accuracy for just one individual, it would be considered an unfair trade-off, and that the resulting model is not preferable because all individuals are equally valuable and their experience is equally valuable. In collectivism, the result would be seen primarily through the lens of having reduced 10% accuracy for one group in order to improve 10% accuracy for one group. In one, fairness is defined as with regard to the individual. In the other, fairness is defined with regard to the group. And there's no measurement or science to arbitrate which of these two positions you should uphold. The only question is which society people prefer based on both immediate and long-term impact. Two other forms of collectivism that have different views are not endorsed by the majority and so not addressed here in the same level of detail. One of those would be superiority, where one's group is considered most important, and the belief that that group should compete to progress more than other groups, in which case the highest desire would be the greatest accuracy of the favored group. The other is that in which groups are observed with regard to recent historic roles related to power and oppression, and favored in order to address or repay suffering or disfavor in those roles. For those who take the power and oppression view, intersectionality makes a satisfactory answer even more difficult, because not only each group would require some sort of balance, and perhaps even favored in some way, based on some often unmeasured degree of suffering, but also every cross-section or group combination would have to be considered and balanced as well. If anyone is interested, I can dig into these another time, but because the others mentioned are the most common dilemma organizations face, I think it makes sense to consider those more important for at least this current discussion. Even on the common views of individualism and collectivism, they are different worldviews with different implications for society, and they can sometimes be irreconcilable. In case you've never thought about it, let's just look through some of the implications of each of these. So these terms were first used in their modern sense in the 19th century and applied to economics, especially the planned economics of early communist writings. Individualism has existed for a while in many ways, but in the economic sense, it grew in popularity out of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, in which he said that it was not only the right theological reality, but also pragmatically the most beneficial to a flourishing society. Karl Marx later came and said that autonomy was an illusion, and your socioeconomic class told the most important thing about you, and that was to be your source of identity, beginning the spread of communism that would take decades to become popular before ultimately fading out under consistently oppressive regimes. Individualism got another surge of momentum, especially from those who reacted against communism's extreme collectivist ideals, such as the extreme reaction of people like Ayn Rand. Where some collectivism begins to break down is when we prioritize one group over another, as opposed to individuals across the entire society as a group. People describe it as a me versus we dilemma, but we is really a consideration for a large group of individuals or me's. And where you make that cutoff matters a lot, especially for defining fairness. It's important to understand that in both, the study is not measured based on how well any single individual performs, but rather what generates the best results for the collection of individuals in the entire society. So both are using the maximum flourishing of society as their benchmark for defining success. Now I'll share my personal view of what position will lead to the most flourishing, at least in the general sense. Overall, I think collectivism faces more challenges based on experiments that have been performed in history. For one, it leads to tribalism, where groups become focused on themselves and the success of their group over others. It consolidates interests so that cycles of division seem to creep up. Two, individuals either suffer or enjoy outcomes, so groups really do not. Anytime we're talking about a group experiencing something, we're talking about the specific individuals in those groups, not the experience of the collection itself. So intervention by taking something from some individuals to give to other individuals in order to optimize outcomes at the group rather than individual level is a slippery slope. Third, one of the biggest reasons it is a slippery territory for treating individuals differently in order to satisfy fairer group level treatment is that selecting group identities quickly breaks down across arbitrary lines that lead to increasingly impossible satisfactory results. What do I mean? So the news stories that come out with regard to things like bad facial recognition are questioning this about large minority groups, such as African Americans. It is not asking the question and making comparable demands for those who are, for example, born with facial clefts, or even those in such a small ethnic minority that it is considered unreasonable to have any similar capability for facial detection. It does not ask the question of how much variance naturally exists within different groups, which the algorithms require to distinguish people. It does not ask where the reasonable line of intersectionality ought to be drawn to require comparable or equal results for any intersection of multiple groups. And so despite having incentives to make the best model for everyone, this problem still persists. And that should tell us something about the solution, that there is not a single universal solution for this problem. The organization and data scientists instead have to work together to determine what they believe about where value and identity reside and create models that exhibit that judgment. Seemingly unrelated but interesting connection I have found is with early political debates, such as those found in the Federalist Papers. One of the top discussions was how to treat different groups fairly and how to avoid any group interests from leading a majority group to oppress or unfairly exert power against another group. The conclusion was that all humans will use group identity along some single interest to gain unfair advantage in treatment, and the only solution for this problem was the division of interests in order to avoid identity from being consolidated into any single group that a person belongs to. This resulted in things like the Electoral College, again, another hotly debated feature of our politics today, where the minority interests in the Electoral College are based on state identity, and there are many identities that fall within that, would have a stronger voice, even though it wouldn't be quite as strong as the majority states. It's likely that similar compromises will be the most common approach taken by companies looking to create fair algorithms. In the example of facial recognition, it might be determined that completely ignoring the impact on groups facing low representation is not the kind of society we want to live in. It might also be determined that completely equal outcomes across all groups of concern is not possible, and that if it means giving a negative outcome for more people of one group in order to benefit fewer members of another group, such as taking $10 from 4 individuals in order to give $10 to just one individual of another group, is also not really the type of justice that we want to enforce. This decision will be further complicated by the reality that data science is not this cut and dry. For example, the accuracy effects will not be the same in every model. Other approaches and modeling techniques might improve outcomes without harming any group, though they're not likely to resolve all disparity, especially if there's less information available for one group. And there are threshold questions that might come into play as well. So where do we draw the line to ensure certain acceptable thresholds of outcomes are still met, even while allowing some differences to exist? I'm interested to hear what others are thinking, though, so don't be arrogant or rude, but please feel free to comment below on how you would view this problem and what kinds of solutions you think might be best and mutually endorsed by others. For those interested in this discussion outside of data science, in areas of politics, here's some additional information that goes into questions data scientists do not necessarily have to answer for now. The only reason I'll mention them here is because the outcomes for these discussions will impact what is considered fair algorithms in the future. I mentioned earlier that one idea of fairness is with regard to oppression and groups related to different levels and roles of power and oppression. This is also sometimes referred to as cosmic justice, or justice that seeks not only equal opportunity to receive societal benefits within its context, but also offset that opportunity for any perceived disadvantages that have been caused by past injustices or disadvantages that have come from outside of someone's control. In this case, maybe it would be argued that an algorithm that provides credit scores, for example, should provide an adjustment to give additional opportunity to those who were unjustly shifted into cycles of poverty that have resulted in lower credit scores, based on all relevant and obtainable data today. With regard to this, we have to answer if we believe responsibility and suffering exists at the local level of individuals or the collective level of group identity. In law today, individuals are held accountable for their actions, groups are not, but there's much debate on whether or not groups hold responsibility to resolve the sins of other individuals who have been a part of that group. This happens most openly in reparation debates. The implications for those debates are not isolated to federal grants or even affirmative action plans, but they will impact how fairness is defined even for algorithms that are making a lot of these decisions. Some of the most fringe parts of these conversations even go so far as to say that groups have different natures and ought to receive different treatment based on that reality. While I think this makes for good content in popular media and is growing in popularity somewhat again today, it still seems at this time far from the most commonly held position. If the decision is made to adjust algorithms to produce outcomes that do offset for past injustices or disadvantages of any particular group, every person involved will have the responsibility to also find an agreed upon measure for how much disadvantage any group has suffered beyond that which they're responsible for, and so requires an adjustment or a bias adjustment. That challenge of measurement has not been fully developed in most cases, but would be necessary for moving algorithms toward fairer outcomes in such a system. So the next time you see news about reparations, affirmative action, and calls for justice, collective justice, that are being defined by our society today, pay attention. You as a data scientist will be involved in the implementation of fairness as our society deems fit, because your algorithms are making increasingly more decisions on the goods and services that people receive. And there are likely few in your organization, especially from a technical perspective, who will understand the trade-offs that are being made and how fairness should be defined, or even how you will implement that idea of fairness as it's defined into your algorithms. Thank you again for joining us on what is sure to be one of the more controversial topics I'll address in data science. If you have any thoughts on this topic or other topics you would like to hear about, please include them in the comments below. And until next time, peace.